Do that one. Hello everybody. So in this video we'll talk about diets, nutrition for truck drivers. One thing about being an owner operator, you do a lot of research. Hey, health, maintaining your health is a very important part of your business plan. Because obviously if you're in the best optimal health, then you're going to be able to perform like an athlete at your highest level. If you are overweight and in poor health, your productivity is going to suffer. Low productivity is going to affect profit. So you would say, well, why as a business person or why as an owner operator do we need to even talk about diet, nutrition, or health? It's because there's money in this. Of course, we wouldn't do it if there wasn't any money in this. Um, it's good for you, obviously, but there is a business minded approach to a lot of things, including diet, nutrition. So let me start by saying before you do anything, you should, review it with your primary care physician. You say, hey, look, I'm going to start this new diet, and get their opinion. You want to get a blood test, because the blood test is going to establish a baseline of where you're at before you start the diet. Because you want to notice if there's any differences. One of the key things you want to focus on is, for example, your kidney function, because your kidneys may not like your new diet, and if it's keto or carnivore, your kidneys may not like the additional protein or animal fat that those diets sometimes include. So, for example, uh, you may want to try a carnivore diet. Okay, you take a blood test and your kidneys are fine. Your doctor says, hey, great, go try your carnivore diet if that's what you want to do. So you try it, and then you take another blood test, whether it's 2 weeks or a month later. Don't wait too long, and see how it affected your kidneys. In some cases, the carnivore diet will lower your kidney function. You know, it it's surprising. It's surprising how your body reacts. You don't even know. You don't know how these diets are going to affect your body. But you know, just for reference here, 7 out of 10 Americans have chronic kidney disease. Okay, 9 out of 10 of those who have chronic kidney disease don't know they have chronic kidney disease. So here you start this diet and you've already, have a condition that you're not aware of, and your diet could make it worse, make it real worse. And if your kidneys shut down, you may end up on dialysis. If you go on dialysis because your kidney shut down, you won't be driving truck. You're not allowed to drive truck if you're on dialysis. So, there are some serious health concerns there when we look at these different diets, and you're like, which one's best for truck drivers? It's like, well, yeah, you want to lose weight, but you don't want to destroy your kidneys in the process. So, I'm a big fan of Dr. Berg, Berg. He has a version of healthy keto, heavy on vegetables, but he does include some animal protein and animal fat. Um, I tried that for many, many years and had good results. The thing with the diets is hard to maintain. It's very hard to maintain, and you just never give up. That's the thing. It's so easy to fall off the bandwagon and gain 10 pounds. I mean, you can gain weight so freaking fast, but trying to lose 2 pounds, it's almost impossible. So that's the frustrating part with diets, is that you can't maintain it. And I think Dr. Berg's healthy keto is a good one, but I would recommend, again, get that blood test before you start that diet. And let's talk about keto. What is keto? Keto is short for ketosis. Ketosis is when your body is using ketones for energy instead of carbs. So most people are burning carbs. They have what's called the Standard American Diet. It's called SAD, and it's intentional to be called SAD because it's a sad diet. The Standard American Diet is high in carbs, high in bad fat, and high in protein, high in salt, and it leads to things, what they call metabolic syndrome, which is overweight, your obesity, you have high blood pressure, you could have pre-diabetes, you kind of have like the pot belly thing going on, and your health is on a downward trajectory. That's the standard American diet. So there are other diets. I mean, healthy keto is a good one. Mediterranean diet is considered a really good one. So you have healthy keto, you have Mediterranean, you have carnivore diet. Um, a lot of these things are focusing on lowering the carbohydrates and increasing healthy choices like fruit and vegetables, fish. You know, uh, getting away from the pasta, the pizza, the hamburger buns, the French fries, all that stuff that's high in starch, high in carbohydrates. Usually it's high in salt too. And make healthier choices, things what they call whole foods versus processed foods. Whole foods are like natural occurring foods. It's like you don't need to read the label on an apple. That's a whole food. An apple is a whole food. You buy something out of the vending machine like Ritz crackers, and it's got 20 ingredients. That's processed food. That processed food is really not food. It's junk food. This is, we grew up, and when I grew up, that was junk food. That's junk food. So people didn't eat junk food. Nowadays, everybody eats junk food. So they talk about obesity currently is, everywhere. You probably see it as a truck driver. Everywhere you go, everybody looks like they could lose 20 pounds. When I grew up in the 70s, it wasn't like that. Not at all. It was, a lot of people were, fairly fit and healthy. They didn't look overweight. They were active, so the way people, choose food and what they're eating has changed over the decades. And their food choices have got progressively worse. So this is where Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's really focused in on this stuff, which is great. It's really great. But I've tried all the diets, and currently I'm trying the vegetarian diet because it's healthier on the kidneys. Animal protein and animal fat, it's a heavier protein than, like, say, a plant-based protein. So it works. Too much protein is not good for your kidneys. So, this is where if you see these diets and there's like the carnivore diet, I mean, it's all meat. For some people, they can handle it. Probably younger people. I don't know. I don't know who these people are that all they can do is eat meat. But what they're doing by eating only meat is they're eliminating all the carbohydrates, and they're putting their body into ketosis. Because what happens when you eat carbohydrates is you spike insulin. Insulin is the hormone that tells your cells to absorb the energy that you consumed. What happens is that your body develops what's called insulin resistance. That means that it no longer responds to insulin. It's so overwhelmed by the amount of insulin that your body's producing because you're eating way too many carbs that it just shuts down. It just feels like, we're ignoring you. And this is where you get into diabetes, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. This is why people have to take insulin shots. Because I think it's one thing if your body doesn't produce insulin, which I think is type 1 diabetes. It's another thing if your body produces insulin, but your cells don't accept it. That's type 2 diabetes. So if you have diabetes, you can't drive truck. So here we are, dialysis, you can't drive truck, diabetes, you can't drive truck. What else? Blood pressure. This is one that gets me all the time. The blood pressure requirements nowadays are very tight. If your blood pressure is above 150 over 90 or above 140 over 90, they only give you a 3-month driving, physical. And say come back in 3 months, and you have to have your blood pressure under control. Otherwise, you can't drive. So there's 3 things right there that can knock you out of driving. Blood pressure, diabetes, dialysis. And there's new regulations coming out all the time. Now they want to pass regulations that says you can't be morbidly obese and drive a truck, or look at all the drivers who have sleep apnea machines, because what is sleep apnea? From my understanding, it's a symptom of the metabolic syndrome, which is part of the standard American diet, which is you have poor nutrition, you're overweight, and when you go to sleep, you stop breathing because of poor nutrition, being overweight, not maintaining your health. So, as a business person, you say, well, we don't need to spend any time on this whatsoever. And I would say, au contraire. You do need to spend time on this, because you got to take that damn physical, whether it's yearly or every 2 years, whatever it may be, you got to pass that physical. When I was doing healthy keto, before I started doing the vegetarian thing, I used to be able to pass the physical easily and get 2-year renewal certificates. But it takes a lot of discipline to stick to those types of diets. And I would say, as the years go by, you continuously study, diet, nutrition, look at all the different options that are available to you. You start learning this just like you started learning being an owner operator. It's like, I know a lot about diet, nutrition. This isn't necessarily a channel about diet, nutrition, but I've incorporated it into my business model. Because part of my business plan is to maintain healthy status so that I can have a long driving career and make a lot of money. But you can't make a lot of money if you don't maintain your health. So it is related to being a small business owner. But I would never recommend a diet to anybody. Everybody is slightly, unique. Their body composition, their DNA, things like this, their family history and medical history. What works for one guy is not necessarily going to work for another guy. So like I get great results from the vegetarian diet and from the healthy keto diet, which is heavy on vegetables. Another guy could try it and no results, So I can't say one size fits all. It's like one size does not fit all. People come, their family origins from all over the world. They have unique genetic structure, and their body responds differently to different types of food than other people. It just so happens that I respond positively. I feel my best when I eat a lot of vegetables. Other people may have other dietary preferences. There's a book my doctor recommended to me. The book was called, I'll find the link, I'll put it in the description when we're done. It's like How Not to Die. And I'm like, oh, that's a good title. I like that. How Not to Die. And it's a book for vegetarians. And in there it talks about blood pressure. And they studied different groups of people from all over the world, and They found a group of people that had perfect blood pressure, 110 over 70, but the whole group were lifetime vegetarians, and they never had issues with blood pressure. And I think the only way to have great blood pressure is to be a vegetarian. I just think that, you start consuming even healthy animal protein like fish, you know, that could contribute to, why you have, maybe mild blood pressure concerns or elevated blood pressure. But the people with the best blood pressure were all vegetarians. So I mean, if you're on blood pressure medicine and you're struggling with blood pressure and you eat a lot of protein, you may want to think about that. Talk to your doctor and ask them. But and I'll post a link for that book in the description when we're done. I use it as a reference book. I mean, the damn thing is like 3 inches thick. And I'm not going to go through every single medical condition. My doctor recommended it, so it's more like a medical book than a book for the average consumer. But I just flip through it, specific items. I'm like, okay, I'll read that chapter, but I'm not reading these other chapters. It has nothing to do with me. So I use it as a reference book. The Mediterranean diet is really, really good. There's this concept out there in the diet world called the blue zone. And the blue zone is looking at people all over the world who live the longest. They're like the ones that are, southern Italy or the Japanese or, somewhere in these tropical habitats that they look at their nutrition and try to link why they live so long based on their nutrition. And one of the reasons they found, like in the Mediterranean, why the Mediterranean diet was so good was because they use a lot of extra virgin olive oil in their cooking and as a dressing on their salads and everything. And this is a very healthy fat. And these different groups consume olive oil on a daily basis. So this is one of the great things about studying different diets is you see, things that you like about that diet, and then you incorporate it into your own diet. It's like, so I eat extra virgin olive oil every single day. Avocado oil is another excellent source, what they consider a healthy fat. And there's others that are considered unhealthy. Vegetable oil is unhealthy. I know you'd think, logically, okay, I need to eat vegetables to be healthy. Here's vegetable oil. Not healthy. Not healthy at all. It's the worst, one of the worst things you can eat. When they look at chronic diseases and they look at root causes of some of the worst diseases out there, a lot of times it's vegetable oil, some of the root cause. I know RFK Jr. is taking a hard look at that stuff, and you may see changes in the food industry here in the United States, based on RFK's efforts. In other parts of the world, like in Europe, they have tighter control over the ingredients that the companies are allowed to put in their food. And when we look at exporting products from the United States, whether it's animal products or processed food, like the Europeans, they don't want it, and why don't they want it? Well, it's because our beef, our poultry, our pork, they use antibiotics. They pump these animals with a lot of drugs, and they feed them genetically modified feed, corn, GMO, or soybean. Soybean's really bad, really, really bad, especially if you're a guy, because it's not good for your prostate. So if you see soybean, even in the vegetarian world, I stay away from soybean. And it's something that you just got to constantly learn about this stuff. Research it, watch videos, join Facebook groups, talk to other drivers. I try to work on the diet every single day, and then I also walk. If I can, I'd like to walk about 3 miles a day. That's not always possible. But if I can get my steps in, like 10,000 steps per day, doing pretty good. I ate pretty good for the day, and then I got out of the truck and I did some walking for the day. That's pretty good. And again, if the weather is bad, it's hard to maintain that stuff. But you got to try to fit it in whenever possible. So I don't recommend a specific diet. What I do recommend is, work with your primary care physician and get that blood test before you try anything. And then try the Mediterranean diet. Try the healthy keto diet with Dr. Berg. You know, be very, very careful with that carnivore diet. That's a dangerous diet. You got to think about your kidneys when you're doing some of this stuff. If you eat diets heavy on vegetables, that's probably a pretty good diet. Um, some of these other diets are kind of like fad diets. They're popular. A lot of them get results because they eliminate the carbohydrates. You eliminate the carbohydrates, that's like half the battle. But you really want to be a student of the game. You want to incorporate this topic or this aspect into your business plan. Because you could be successful as a driver, as an owner operator. If you don't have your health, none of it's worth it. So I did the video, the 5 keys to success, and one of the keys was you got to have a primary care physician. You got to maintain good health. And if you don't have that, you really don't have anything. Because that credit score don't mean nothing. Being out of debt don't mean nothing. Having money saved don't mean nothing. Your most valuable asset as a driver is your health and the ability to drive. You lose that, you lose a lot. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.